Hey, you're listening to Cloud and Clear. I'm your host, Rocky Giglio, and excited to have Don Duet, he's CEO and co-founder of Concourse Labs, on with me today. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe down below. Hey, Don, super happy to have you on. I guess let's just jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you spent 30 years at Goldman Sachs. You've been developing software, large corporations around the world. So give us a little bit of your background and how you got into the security space.
Sure. No, thank you, Rocky. Happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. So as you mentioned, I've held senior leadership roles in technology at Goldman Sachs for over almost 30 years. I was the firm's CTO and a partner, helped drive a lot of the technology strategy at Goldman, worked a lot with the industry, particularly over the last 10 years with many of the cloud providers, really helping kind of move Goldman Sachs up into public infrastructure, really helping design and build for this next generation of technology. More recently, I founded Concourse Labs along with Jairam, who is one of my colleagues at Goldman Sachs and a co-founder, with our goal really to help simplify cloud governance, security, and compliance, and provide continuous visibility and control over all cloud assets. This is one of the critical learnings we had at Goldman through our journey to public cloud, was that the need to really build and design technology to facilitate for operating in cloud at scale with critical assets was essential. So we're hopefully helping a lot of the industry with that journey as well.
Love it. Yeah, it's such an area of just concern today. I mean, everybody's in the cloud in some way, shape, or form. And then you have, provider sprawl, and, you've got folks building and deploying things and, on their own personal credit cards, and, just things are everywhere, right? And so you end up with this real need to start driving policy from the top down, and then making sure that those things are in place. And even, I use the old adage, right? Shift left, right? We need to start shifting all of that left so that we're thinking about policy and control and governance, from the get-go, which is definitely something I'm seeing a lot more of. And it's a real need. I mean, it's a real need in our customer base. Talked to somebody last week kind of around the same lines of, how do we integrate security into the code that's deploying our infrastructure as we go? So I guess tell me a little bit about kind of what made you want to get into this governance space? Like, what was the need that you saw, and how's Concourse Labs filling that gap?
It's very much as you described. One of the things I think that's under-recognized is that, everything when you move to cloud is impacted. And so the way you think about your developer practices, the way that you look to, build data and content management. So, the cloud does affect everything, but in a substantially more outsized way. The cloud really does impact the way that companies have historically managed technology and security and control, and both from the very basic inherent kind of risk perspective. And in many corporates where you're on premise, you may have a little section of your environment you'd call your DMZ or demilitarized zone, where you'd run client internet-facing applications, but it was a tiny fraction of your entire kind of infrastructure and application base. And in there, you really had to extremely focus on controls, because you were facing off to the external world. You had, many different types of risks that you would not have, and where you're protected by your own firewall. When you move to cloud, that problem just gets, multiplied, because now everything that you're running is in public cloud has some degree of inherent risk, that it's running and operating in a way that could be connected to the internet. It's ultimately going to be, provided from a hosting perspective by a third party. So the fundamental challenge for risk control and governance just really does change in a very dramatic way when you move to public cloud. And we see that kind of as ultimately that starting point for, ultimately why do you need to rethink security? How do you really need to kind of embrace kind of a new generation of how to operate, manage, and work successfully in public cloud environments versus on-premise? And it really does require that degree of rethink.
And I guess along those lines, like, what are you guys seeing as kind of the top trends here this year? Like, what do you think is the things everyone's going to be talking about and needing to really solve for coming into 2023?
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, I think, we're seeing a progression in the way that people are thinking about securing public cloud and hybrid cloud environments. Obviously, not exactly a new topic. It's been around for a while, but I think, one of the most important things that we see fundamentally is what we would call kind of the age of enterprise public cloud. So a lot of the early stages of cloud were mostly driven by smaller firms, companies like mine, that really said, we need to start cloud native, but we're starting from scratch versus starting from having a lot of existing technology and processes and procedures. So that's first and foremost. We definitely believe we're in kind of the very early stages of really the enterpriseization of public cloud and how that's going to change and what will become both changes for companies that are consumers of cloud as well as what the services are that the cloud providers are providing, we think is an ongoing story. But when we think about specifically for 2023, a couple of things. Number one, I think infrastructure as code, which again is not a new topic. We're really seeing it get into kind of the mainstream. We're finding, within most customers, infrastructure code is now really the only way they're going to approach procurement in public cloud. We're seeing a lot of kind of this next generation of infrastructure as code, which is usually embodied by building, either platform teams within your own company that create your own custom modules or custom infrastructure that can then be consumed by your development team. So we're seeing this whole new maturitization of infrastructure as code, which is super important because, as you mentioned earlier, like getting to where you can sync control and security deeper into all the different building blocks that we're seeing that, is also playing itself out in infrastructure code, but also having a new generation with, the kind of approach towards common shared modules that then ultimately are used to create kind of the building blocks for cloud from an application perspective. Secondly, I think a continuing story, but I think getting, extremely more highlighted in 2023 will be the whole fundamental of physics and automation. And so, as companies really start to move beyond their early stage usage of public cloud into much more mainstream, and you're going from tens to hundreds of applications, maybe on your path to thousands, just the physics of that just mean that you can't do things manually. You can't do manual reviews of change. You can't do manual architecture assessments of your application designs. Everything is on a path towards automation. And we see that, again, very much accelerating, whether it be what people may talk about in terms of risk posture management. At the end of the day, we think everything in all the fundamental aspects of the security management chain are going to move into an automation framework. And that's hopefully the effect of that means that more and more of what the security teams can focus on are higher order problems, higher order degrees of looking for managing threats and what's next in the equation. And then third, I would say, this continued, you mentioned shift left. We kind of think of it as the movement towards preventative control, that recognizing that, being in the cloud and being in a risk environment from a production perspective, it's too late to find issues. So a lot of the early stages of cloud security were focused on detective type controls. How can I find things as soon as possible from the point of view of the runtime? And we see that, having accelerated, and we think 2023 is going to be, kind of almost a tipping point year where it's going to be really hard to explain why you're not doing preventative controls, why you're not getting in front of, even before you provision, to ensure that what you're going to provision is going to actually meet your needs from a security and regulatory perspective. So all of these three kind of major focus areas, we think also has the backdrop of helping with this, long march towards zero trust and embracing zero trust philosophy. But we feel those three as the principal focuses for 2023 from a lot of our clients and people we're working with in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're seeing the same here. And of course, the industry's seeing the same. If you go read anything from Forbes, CIO, whomever, you're going to see those same trends kind of top of the list, right? We've got to do better at automating things, integrating security into our code and deployment policies and pipelines even. And then you brought up something which is really interesting. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how Concourse is helping customers solve this problem. But that is the sprawl of code, right? If you go to deploy an infrastructure today, GitHub is full of, infrastructure code that you can go grab, copy, paste, deploy. You've got container images, just on and on down the list. And all good developers copy and paste, right? We know that. We know that's true. If you've done any sort of development in your life, like you've surely copied and pasted your code from somewhere, right? And then, something interesting is the whole ChatGPT thing, right? So you're going to have this robot answering questions and sending code to your developers and your infrastructure guys, right, who are trying to keep up with the pace of cloud. And how does Concourse Labs really help a customer in that type of an environment, right? Because that is an ongoing challenge. And I think from a maturity model, it's something we have to focus on this year and kind of going forward, which is how do we limit those sources and make sure they're secure?
You hit it on the head, right? I mean, it's sprawl, and not just sprawl of code, sprawl of everything, of code, of tools, of kind of various processes and procedures that you're operating. When you think about kind of the total landscape for how do I look at how can I operate over, and what do I need to operate over in order to do whatever degree of introspection I need in order to confirm that I'm in compliance with a control objective or security objective. That landscape is very broad, very diverse, and only increasing so. And so I think that is one of the major kind of fundamental problems that people have when they're approaching public cloud, in particular, is again just diversity and complexity of their existing environments, the way that accelerates often as they move into public cloud environments, the way that the velocity of that also accelerates as they start embracing agile and CI/CD and DevOps practices. So, all that becomes a major challenge. When we started Concourse Labs, a big part of our philosophy and really kind of foundation was that solving for and providing a deflator to this inflation problem, right? That the more applications, the more you innovate, the more you're going to build applications and software, the more that's going to add to the complexity that you need to manage. And so a big part of what we focus in on is really enabling the ability for policy to become a critical flattener of that. So the ability to be able to express controls and objectives that you need, and then be able to implement those over a very diversified set of applications, infrastructure, languages, and so forth is what we focus in on. So part of our technical architecture is fundamentally, the ability to think of policy as a single first-class entity in your application and your data environments, and to support the ability for those policies to apply over a very robust and increasingly larger set of artifacts and data sets, whether those are all the way upstream into your SCM and your build time, or they're all the way downstream in the actual runtime of your cloud, that really kind of supporting that across both the diversity of solutions and the diversity of things you need to introspect, as well as that full life cycle from creation all the way through to actual running and operating in a live production cloud environment.
Yeah, it's interesting because automation just naturally flows out of that, right? You can't achieve any of that without automation built into that, right? So you start thinking about
automation, and it's a major part of the value of policy, which I think a lot of people don't often think about, because policy is is a big word. You can extrapolate that into lots of different kind of meanings, but ultimately what it does, which is incredibly valuable, is it forces you to truly formalize, to explain, what is right and what is wrong, and what is right and what is wrong in this context, or for this particular way that I'm programming this piece of code, or this particular way that I'm constructing this service in the cloud. So it could be painful in the sense that it really forces you to take these kind of high level ways we like to talk about risk and control, but then you have to really nail it down. But the great thing about it is once you nail it down, you now have an artifact. You now have something that you continue to maintain, you can expand, you can grow, and to your point before, you can share, because you're probably having lots of places where you're doing the same thing, but you're maybe reinventing the wheel each time. And so having a shared, policy as code artifact that can be deployed across your organization gives you great scale and leverage. But the formalization of it is super important. If you want to automate something, you need to be able to make decisions in software. That means you need to have kind of the rule set in software in order to make that evaluation. And one of the things we find when people embrace policy as code that they realize very quickly, again, is that kind of, that need to kind of get to literal formalization is both incredibly powerful and beneficial for them, but it's also just hard to do socially, and within many organizations it often requires a degree of collaboration that may not intrinsically have been there. Are the control people really talking to the security first line of defense team? Are they talking to the actual architecture teams and the developers? Getting that dialogue in place that ultimately yields this kind of well-defined set of rules and requirements at a level of detail that you can now codify it and really drive automation is where you get to a big part of the benefit.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a huge struggle for most customers, right? Is we all know we should formalize and we should bring those policies in and we should be maturing those policies, but it's really hard to do because of all the things you just said, right? All the players that are involved in that. And so I really like the idea of, as we start to automate those policies and integrate them as we do try to shift left with security, it forces us to mature, right? It forces us to really kind of come together and say, how's this policy, this is what this policy means, and here's how we're going to implement this policy kind of start to finish across the organization. And that really is going to drive maturity in conversation, change of behavior across teams, better collaboration. And if you don't achieve it, right, at least it gives you a measure of, these are things we need to fix, right?
Absolutely. And knowing that it's everything changes. So whatever you decided was the right set of logic and rules today, it's going to be different tomorrow. It really acts as like an IP contract across these different groups and teams. And, in some ways that is the most long-term beneficial, that as you start moving to where you are kind of working more collaboratively on this IP contract that is your set of policy as code, it creates the basis for that to be efficient, for that to be, well understood, for really kind of, again, groups that may feel somewhat orthogonal to each other, that's how they can kind of get that guarantee that they can understand if I'm building software, these are the rules that I have to abide by. It's clear, it's documented, it's in code. I can see it in my IDE. If I'm, on the opposite side of the equation and I'm sitting, more in a second line or first line of defense function, I know what all the rule sets are. And I know as I believe we need to improve our risk posture or change it, I know that I also need to kind of embed that into these contracts. So it creates a really virtuous process, for companies. And as you start kind of envisioning this future where more and more of your data and your applications are running in an increasingly larger number of third-party locations, it just creates a necessary fabric for really kind of operating that safely.
We've developed what we call the Cloud Security Confidence Program, and kind of the premise is exactly that, right? We're all at a certain state today, and there's different areas where we need to focus, and this kind of drives a lot of those conversations, right? Which is, how do we really get to a point where we can confidently say we have the right behaviors, the right policies, the right automations, the right tools to achieve the security goals that we have as an organization, and not feel like, man, at any moment, the crap's just going to hit the fan, and we're going to get that phone call that somebody's been in our environment for the last 180 days, stealing all our data and sending all our customers data. Like, how do we achieve that? And I think part of that is building that confidence that we've taken the time to think about the policy. We've taken the time to start maturing the way we implement security from the beginning, right, all the way through to production and then end of life. And then you hit something earlier when you were kind of listing some of the top trends, which is getting to that zero trust model, like a true zero trust model. A lot of times as organizations, I think we think about zero trust as like this end user computing thing, right? Hey, your computer's not trusted. You sit out there, and when you attach to my environment, we don't trust your device and we don't trust you as a user. But it's really a broader, zero trust is really broader than that, right? It touches things like data and infrastructure, and really not trusting, I'm not going to trust the front end application server to touch the back end database, right? There's zero trust there, and driving that across the infrastructure that runs our businesses, as well as obviously the users and their identities. But building that in kind of feeds into this whole conversation we're having about, policy and driving that policy. You're not going to achieve zero trust without that policy element either, right? So talk a little bit about that and kind of what you're seeing there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of people, given that zero trust really found its way first and foremost into the workplace, and how, you can kind of broker what, someone in your organization can get access to in terms of computing services. So it makes a lot of sense that that's where a lot of the perspective got anchored to. We see zero trust, I think, very much in the way you just described it, which is to truly embrace zero trust principles means you need to think about many different identities, not just human identity, but machine identity, data identity, workload identity, and that's a core part of many of the architectural principles that we have, which is to support that service account identity. I mean, there are so many different things, but again, part of what we really see is both the ability to kind of have an identity-driven architecture, and then really kind of we focus a lot in our world because we there's lots of different aspects of zero trust. Our principal focus is to say, how do you really kind of treat policy as first class? So having identity for your policies, having identity and versioning, so how they've changed over time, having well-defined role and access-based design model. So who's allowed to write policies over which part of your company are they apply to. There's a tremendous, we think, amount of both benefit and complexity for managing kind of policy as its own first class item, and then being able to associate those policies to those identities, whether it be principal data that I think have a very high risk benefit factor, that I can associate those identities to those data sets to these sets of policies. So that kind of capability to move into much more of a contextual based approach to how you're controlling and managing risk. At the end of the day, risk management is not just kind of following a set of, tick the box. It's really saying, what is about this information or this asset that I'm trying to protect? What's the best way to protect it, and really kind of enable it to do what it's intended to do in the best form? And so it really forces you into a much more of a localized versus kind of centralized view of control. But if you have an automation framework and you have identity and you're maintaining and managing this, you can get to scale. And that's really what we focus on helping people with. We hopefully become the platform in which they can really build both their identities, help them create their policy content, and then bring them together in a way that's both very scalable, but also very, very targeted and very efficient.
Yeah, I love it. And I think, that's where we see a lot of momentum. We're kind of all in on Google as a company here at SADA. We've done a lot of work developing the professional services around their platforms and technologies. And that's really what led to this conversation that you and I are having today, which is you guys are also there, right? You're developing with Google, you're working with SADA. Kind of what made you decide to do that? How does that help in Concourse Labs kind of achieve your goals?
Well, first off, we're a very customer focused business. So we, really kind of follow our clients and we help them, become successful in cloud. And increasingly we're finding that a lot of our clients are turning to Google, and that's fantastic. I personally have had longstanding relationships with Google going back to my time at Goldman, where we worked on many different things that are pretty commonplace today, including the creation of the whole bring your own key architecture. Back to talking about earlier, I think we're still in the early stages of how the cloud itself is going to adapt to enterprise usage, but that was an early example, of ways that the cloud infrastructure and ecosystem adapted by the teams at Google, really helping create that design of I can bring my own key in order to protect data, so I don't have to trust the cloud providers for everything, and I can choose where I choose to do that. But our path to working with SADA and Google started with clients, started with customer demand, which is fantastic. And we're in the process right now of replatforming our product onto GCP, and we had the fortunate capability to be introduced to SADA, and it's been a great partnership. So SADA is helping us really kind of bring our product onto GCP, run and operate it at scale on the GCP platform, and be integrated into the GCP marketplace, which knock wood, will be live and will be up and running in a matter of a couple of weeks. And but that's kind of how our interaction with SADA really began, and we've had a great experience working with the engineering team there.
We love working with companies like Concourse Labs and really helping change the way we're operating in Google Cloud with our customers, helping ISV alliance partners like you guys kind of get off the ground and make that investment, because we're seeing a lot of adoption, obviously on the Google side, and they're well established now as a player in this cloud space and providing a lot of scale. And as they enter, I think you said it earlier, right? The cloud environment is coming into its own, and this enterprise grade operating models, across all the cloud providers, obviously, but customers in particular have this expectation. And so we're excited to be helping, Concourse Labs do these things and have you on the show here and talking about this. And I guess with that, I want to turn back to kind of the security conversation. And if you were talking to a CISO today, somebody's getting started in this, they're just thinking about moving to cloud, or they just got into the cloud, trying to mature that. Actually, let's go to the whole enterprise story, right? You're in the cloud, you've been operating there for a while. What are the things you would turn and kind of say, hey, these are the things you need to be doing as a CISO today, 2023, with all the things going on in 2023, we still need to be thinking about this. And what are those things you'd say?
Yeah, I think depending on the maturity of the person and their team's kind of use of cloud, if they were just beginning, I would say, engage in the security planning process early. And I would also say, recognize that part of, your responsibility and frankly, your great opportunity is to be engaged very actively in what is the architecture and the functional and technical architecture for cloud. Because I do think, regardless whether you're beginning or you're midway through your journey, and certainly those who are well on their way to their journey, I think would reinforce this point that security and controls just need to be at the table, right? Where we see success in cloud experiences, it's fundamentally correlated to where the control teams are active players, active design, they're actively involved, they're first class in the solution set. Where we see challenges often is when that isn't the case, and security is looked at either as a supporting function, but not critical to the design and architecture of how we're going to approach cloud, or in worst cases where it's viewed principally as a control gate or a toll keeper, ultimately, and really divorced from the approach. And so that would be the first and foremost. I think, secondly, very much as we mentioned earlier, we think that a risk-based approach is essential, that there's just too much benefit risk reward in cloud, going down a path of only looking to control through automation, true, secure, invariant. So things that just should never be true. That's great, except it leaves a lot of things that are judgment driven that are now automated. So again, part of the benefit of policy is you could straddle both. You could have policy that's absolute, this must be true and there's no exceptions. And you could have policy, again, that becomes much more contextually defined, that starts to automate things that are sometimes true and sometimes false, depending on, your application or your identity or whatever, whatever the kind of decision process is.
That's an interesting one, because that's, I think, where the AI ML starts to trickle in here, right? Because we do have,
I think AI has a big role to play there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there are still, quite a bit of deterministic aspects, because at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of, you can learn a lot from what you do, and you can kind of decode from that ideally, what feels to be best practices. But, particularly in regulated firms, although I would say that's not entirely completely true, but but certainly true and regulated. But I think that ability to know and say, this is what I chose, this was my decision based on my criteria, is extremely important. So there's both a combination of learned, I think, and deterministic. But it's still, the bottom line is, envision like a future where you have a lot more applications and data than people that needs to be operating safely. All that, I think, brings you back towards the recognition that you need automation, and automation is probably going to need a platform to facilitate that in order to accomplish it at scale.
Well, Don, good to have you on the show. Thanks for taking some time out with us here and joining me on Cloud and Clear. This is an exciting year. I mean, there's a lot of changes. I think the maturity that customers are expecting and needing to drive, particularly this year. I think, the macroeconomic situation is causing us all to say, we need to do these things to protect us in the long term. But then there's also the reality of, we've made investments. It used to be the security was a spend of fear, right? Hey, we got to do this. You're going to get hacked. And so we go buy all these tools. I think we've reached a point now on that maturity curve where our customers are saying, okay, yeah, we need these tools. We don't want to be in the news, but we need to be having a more programmatic approach to why we're doing what we're doing and what benefit and value we're getting out of the tools that we have purchased. Where the gaps are in the way we approach security and policy, like we've been talking about. And I think policy, like you said earlier, is really going to help us drive that conversation to a mature state and really get the efficiencies we're looking for in the investments that customers are making. So I'm super excited about what you guys are doing with this conversation. And I guess with that, any last words you want to say to the audience here in Cloud and Clear, and we'll wrap up our show for today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Rocky. I really appreciate it. I would say, to the audience, if you're, interested in automation and you're thinking about how to make that scale to the size of your institution, check us out. Come over to concourselabs.com. I think, we've been really kind of driving a lot of value with the clients that we're dealing with, which have tended to be among the largest and most complex. But I think that what we're building and creating can scale for pretty much anybody that's looking for a cloud and trying to build that basis of, how am I going to operate automation through policy as code programs and frameworks. So really appreciate the opportunity to be on today, and thank you very much.
Yeah, likewise, Don. Don't forget to check out Don and Concourse Labs at concourselabs.com. Tune in next time to Cloud and Clear, and like and subscribe below and help us hack Google. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Cloud and Clear. Check the show notes for links to this week's topics. And don't forget to connect with us on Twitter @Cloud and Clear and our website, sada.com. Be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app.